The morning of April 4th, 1945, moves fast and loud through central Germany. Elements of the 4th Armored Division and the 89th Infantry, part of Patton's 3rd Army, are pushing east past Gotha, meeting scattered resistance that thins out the closer they get to a stretch of wooded high ground outside a small town called Ohrdruf. The advance has a rhythm to it by now. Armor forward, infantry clearing behind, radio, traffic steady. Nothing about the morning suggests this particular push through this particular patch of countryside is different from the dozens before it. Then the column comes over a rise and finds a gate standing open with no defenders left behind it, and something on the other side that doesn't match anything the advance has prepared these soldiers to see. The camp behind the gate is known internally as SII, a satellite of the larger Buchenwald complex, built the previous November to supply forced labor for a rail tunnel meant to connect a nearby castle to the German rail network. By March, the prisoner population here had reached close to 12,000 men, drawn from a dozen occupied countries: French, Belgian, Polish, Soviet, Hungarian, Italian, alongside political prisoners and Jews the regime had specifically targeted. These are not soldiers. Under any definition either side claims to operate by, forced laborers held behind wire, unarmed and starving, are as far outside the category of legitimate military targets as a human being can be. That distinction is the entire moral floor this story stands on. In the first days of April, with the American advance closing in, the SS evacuated most of the camp's population on a forced march toward Buchenwald itself. Those too sick or weak to walk were left behind. And as the soldiers entering the camp will shortly discover, left behind does not mean what it should have meant. Among the Americans coming through the gate is Private Don Timmer, 18 years old, a rifleman with the 89th Infantry who had taken German in high school and now finds himself pressed in his service as an interpreter, translating whatever the camp's remaining inmates are trying to tell the soldiers around him. Between the gate and the first row of barracks, Timmer and the others find roughly 30 bodies, the blood still wet, killed only hours earlier by departing guards. Further in, the scene organizes itself into something more deliberate. A shed holds a stacked pile of naked, emaciated corpses, somewhere between 30 and 40 of them, lightly dusted with lime, not enough to destroy the remains, only enough to cut the smell. Prisoners still alive inside the camp explain, through Timmer and others, that the shed is a processing point. When it fills, roughly to a capacity of 200, the bodies are moved to a burial pit a mile away. They estimate that 3,000 men have been buried that way since the 1st of January alone. Elsewhere in the compound, partially burned remains sit on what had clearly been a hurried, incomplete cremation pyre, an attempt, abandoned mid-task, to erase evidence before the Americans arrived. The lime, the pyre, the burial pit a mile from camp. None of this is confusion or panic. It is a system run by people who understood precisely what needed hiding and tried, imperfectly, to hide it before they ran. If a story like this deserves telling at all, it's because what happened at that gate wasn't rumor or secondhand account. It was documented on the spot by soldiers who had orders to record exactly what they found, so no one afterward could claim it hadn't happened. That's the job this channel takes seriously. Not spectacle, the record straight. Word of the discovery moves up the chain within hours. General George Patton, running 3rd Army's advance from his headquarters at Bad Hersfeld, receives the initial reports and immediately telephones General Omar Bradley. 3rd Army had overrun Ohrdruf. Bradley later recalls Patton telling him, insisting Bradley see it for himself, saying he wouldn't believe how bad it was until he'd seen it with his own eyes. Patton also places a call to General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, who is at that point still in Belgium overseeing operations elsewhere on the front. Plans come together quickly. Eisenhower will fly in, and the 3 generals, Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton, will tour the camp together on April 12th, 8 days after its liberation, once the site has been secured and documented enough to walk through safely. In the days between discovery and that visit, the camp remains under American control, guarded, its evidence preserved rather than cleaned up, a deliberate choice, because everyone from Sears on down already understands that what has been found here will need to survive scrutiny later from people who won't have stood at that gate themselves. Eisenhower arrives on the 12th and is led through the camp by a survivor, an Austrian Jewish prisoner familiar with its operations, with an American officer named Lieutenant Aloys Lythan translating alongside him. The tour moves through the gallows, past the pyre of charred remains, into the areas where the camp's remaining evidence sits exactly where the liberating soldiers found it 8 days earlier. Patton, a general not easily rattled by the sight of violence, had already vomited behind a nearby building once the scale of what he was looking at became clear. When the tour reaches the shed holding the naked, emaciated dead, Patton stops at the doorway and does not go in. He tells the others he will be sick if he does. In his diary that night, he writes that it was one of the most appalling sights he had ever seen and describes the shed in exacting procedural detail, capacity, method, the line, the numbers the inmates had given. Eisenhower does go in, along with Bradley, and stays through the full tour until dark, questioning survivors directly through his interpreter. At one point, noticing a young soldier nearby laughing nervously at the sight of a captured German guard, Eisenhower turns and asks him quietly, "Still having trouble hating them?" Is not delivered as a rebuke shouted across the yard. It is quiet, controlled, and it lands harder for it. Eisenhower's response to what he has seen is not emotional in its execution, even if the emotion behind it is plain. Before leaving the camp, he gathers the officers around him and gives an order with no ambiguity in it. Every American unit not actively engaged on the front line is to be brought through Ohrdruf to see it firsthand. We are told that the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for, he tells them. Now, at least, he will know what he is fighting against. Within days, he puts the same instinct into writing, cabling Army Chief of Staff George Marshall in Washington with a first-hand account of the visit, describing the shed Patton wouldn't enter, the testimony of survivors, and his own reasoning for insisting on seeing it in person, so that if anyone in the future tried to dismiss these accounts as propaganda, he could stand as a direct witness who had walked the ground himself. He follows with his second request, asking that American newspaper editors and members of Congress be brought to the liberated camps to see the same evidence with their own eyes. Marshall carries the request to Secretary of War Henry Stimson and President Harry Truman and receives approval. Photographers are dispatched. Documentation becomes policy, not an afterthought. Eisenhower's judgment, applied without exception, that first-hand evidence was the only kind that would hold. That same judgment extends to the German civilians living just outside the wire. Colonel Hayden Sears, commanding the armored unit that first found the camp, orders 25 residents of Ohrdruf to walk the grounds and see what their army had done in their name. Standing before them as an interpreter reads the full list of what was found, Sears gives a direct instruction. Make them look at the tools used to turn bodies on the pyre. Make them stand closer. Don't let them look away. When some of the townspeople insist they had no knowledge of what happened inside the wire, an infantry lieutenant named Joe Friedman pushes back without raising his voice. How could they not have known? He asks, when the smell alone should have told them everything. Among those ordered to tour the camp is Ohrdruf's mayor, Albert Schneider, and his wife. Along with the other assembled townspeople, they are made to help bury the dead in individual graves, a task that stretches across a full day, with roughly 4/5 of it completed before dark, the remainder promised for the following morning. That promise is never kept. That night, Schneider and his wife are found hanged in their home. The note they leave behind is short. We didn't know, but we knew. Private Timmer, still functioning as an interpreter days after the liberation, is the one called on to translate it for the American officers standing in the house. When word of the suicide reaches Eisenhower, his reaction is measured rather than triumphant. He calls it, in his own words, the most encouraging thing he'd heard, evidence that some capacity for shame had survived intact in people who claimed ignorance right up until they were made to stand in the middle of the proof. Ohrdruf would not be the last camp Americans liberated that April, Buchenwald, Dachau, and others followed within weeks, each one photographed, filmed, and documented under the same standing order Eisenhower had given at Ohrdruf's gate. That footage would later be entered as evidence at Nuremberg, a direct, unbroken line from Patton refusing to step into a shed full of the dead to a courtroom where the people responsible were made to answer for it under oath. The judgment Eisenhower made in that camp was simple and never wavered. See it yourself, record it precisely, and make sure no one could ever credibly claim it hadn't happened. These stories hold up today for exactly that reason, because someone insisted on writing them down while the evidence still stood in front of him.